Today's event is going to be webinar style. So we're going to hear from an incredible set of panelists and folks who have been working at this intersection of gender, climate, and transport for some time. We encourage folks to use the Q&A function to share thoughts and questions that you have that you'd like to pose to the panelists at the end of the event. And we'll also include lots of information about how to follow up and be in touch. Today's event will also be recorded. So without further ado, my name is Mara Dolan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here representing the Women's Environment and Development Organization, or WeDo. And WeDo was founded in 1990 and is a global women's advocacy organization working for a just world that promotes and protects human rights, gender equality, and the integrity of the environment. So before offering some framing comments for where this conversation and this panel will sit, I'd love to actually just start out with a question. So we know that we're here to talk about transportation, or I hope everyone knows that we're here to talk about transportation. And what probably comes to mind for many of us are things like trains and buses and cars. And I want us to really I want to invite us to expand our understanding of transport in this conversation and beyond. So transportation really is a way to get from one place to another, and it takes on a lot of forms. So if you commuted to work today or before the pandemic, how did you get there? If now or before the pandemic you had kids who went to school or to childcare, how did they get there? What about getting somewhere maybe a little farther off, like healthcare that you may need or groceries? Did you walk? Did you bike? Did you take a bus or several buses? And when you were getting from one place to another, how long did it take you? Who did you encounter? And did they make you feel safe or unsafe? Did you have clean air to breathe on the way? And did you have access to everything you needed to actually use whatever transportation method that was? What about other folks in your community? These are all transport questions, and we're going to open up space to talk about some of those here. So zooming out, we know that we cannot confront the climate crisis without transforming how we all move through the world, right? And we know that right now, the transportation sector accounts for almost 1/3 of US greenhouse gas emissions. And we also know that the US transportation sector is steeped with environmental injustices and environmental racism that harms mostly Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color and low-income communities. And this brief that we're launching today, WeDo is sharing the brief with really the deeply held conviction that we all have the right to move safely and freely through the world. That is the premise upon which we're having this conversation. And across the really varied landscape of transportation infrastructure and mobility systems across the United States, this remains really far from the reality. Across lines of race and class and gender and more, transportation has historically served and serves today to entrench white supremacy, patriarchy, and to deepen wealth inequality. So we know that with an intersectional feminist analysis that can show us how to confront and address how systems of oppression structure our mobility systems, how they're baked in. With that intersectional feminist analysis, it can be possible for transportation to take on new forms. And in other words, we do believe that transportation can be a catalyst for transformation. Try saying that 10 times fast. By realizing, the potential for intentional and equitable investment that actually prioritizes universal access and affordability for all, that takes into account the differentiated needs of users that it has historically marginalized, and learns lessons from feminist transportation advocates, some of which you'll hear from today. US mobility infrastructure can serve as a critical pathway to actually advancing racial, economic, and gender justice. So, as we were preparing for today, we knew that we would be on the cusp of news as well about where the infrastructure talks at the federal level would be, and how transportation, an essential piece of those talks, would look. And we got some of that news last night, of course, with updates on the bipartisan infrastructure deal. And in the months, preceding this moment in the infrastructure talks, I think it's fair to say that we've seen more conversation than ever before about building green and clean infrastructure that actually responds to and can be resilient in the face of the climate crisis, as well as folks actually asking what infrastructure even is, and including critical things like strong and affordable care infrastructure as part of these talks. So at the end, we'll circle back more to this moment of the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the Build Back Better plan and all of these fast-moving pieces to see where this conversation on gender, climate, and transport fits into those. But I'll just point to the fact here as well that, when we saw the updates last night on the infrastructure talk status, and we saw the hard numbers that Congress is talking about, we saw huge cuts to public transit in particular. And the bipartisan package numbers for public transit and renewable energy are a far, far cry from Biden's original plan, which we would argue, and many progressive allies would argue, wasn't big enough in the first place, wasn't equitable enough in the first place. And so it's a huge blow to the hopes of really using this moment to inject big, bold investments into our transportation systems. And so these conversations are urgent. It's more important than ever, especially as we move into reconciliation conversations and the next steps as movements who care about our transport systems, that equity is centered in our conversations about what our transport systems really need to look like. So with all that said, to say I'm excited for this conversation today would really be an understatement. I'm just incredibly honored to be here with these very extraordinary women, feminists, leaders, writers, advocates. And we're going to move through this next hour teach-in style, spending some time hearing first from the author of the brief, then moving into a panel, hearing each of their knowledge and perspectives on the intersection of gender, climate, and transport, before concluding with some Q&A. So please share your questions with us in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring them in order to bring back to the panelists at the end of the call. So to kick us off, I'm going to move to Dr. Reagan Patterson, the author of this brief that is being launched today, which you will also find a link to in the chat. And I encourage folks to read in depth after this conversation as well. And I want to turn to Dr. Reagan Patterson to share more about what's in this brief, why it was necessary to write, and what she was thinking about as she wrote it. So Dr. Reagan Patterson is an environmental engineer and environmental justice consultant who focuses on issues related to transportation equity and air pollution. Currently, she's the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where she conducts intersectional transportation policy analysis and research. And Dr. Patterson earned her PhD in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. So it's an honor to have you here, Reagan, and also to be in conversation with you over the last few months as you wrote this brief. And I want to just start by actually asking you, and this is a big question, so feel free to take it in whatever direction you'd like. Why is transportation a site for much needed transformation?
Yeah, great. First, I want to just say thank you. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you and with these other amazing panelists and transportation advocates. So I'm also very excited to hear what everyone else has to say and engage with everyone on this panel. But starting with why is transportation the site of transformation? It's really because it enables or inhibits people's mobility, their freedom of movement, or the ability, as you said, to move freely, easily, safely in public spaces, or to access services and employment. And so earlier in the week, I had the honor of being on a panel with Wafia Murray, who of Better Bike Share, who made a great point around access justice. We think about transportation justice, but really framing it around this idea of access justice, as you alluded to with your question around how did you get there? So people have places that they need to go, whether, as you mentioned, the grocery store, healthcare, the COVID vaccine, school, or even just, hey, I want to go to my friend's house, my family's house. And so transportation really allows or hinders us from getting there and doing so, again, easily, freely, and safely. And so also, as you touched upon, we have to acknowledge that racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, and transphobia are in our transportation planning, and those very much shape our transportation system, restricting mobility along race, class, and gender lines. And so whether that's historically looking at freeways that racially and economically segregate, underfunded and divested public transit, as you mentioned, additional cuts from this most recent infrastructure bill, or single-use zoning that separates work from our homes, from care areas. And so this leads to or exacerbates isolation from social and economic opportunities. And then it's the prioritization of these freeways and roadways over transit that contributes to automobile dependency and consequently climate change, as you mentioned, with transportation being actually the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And so this auto-centric planning increases vulnerability to disasters, which we are currently experiencing all over the US. So we really need an intersectional feminist lens to transform our transportation system to make it equitable and sustainable.
Thank you so much, Reagan. I think, a lot of folks, when they probably saw the title of this webinar and of the brief too, may have been surprised to see gender as the first word as of the brief's title. And so I'd love to just ask, what does gender have to do with this? What are some key considerations around gender that need to take place in transportation planning?
Yes, and it also talks to like my own, because I do transportation work, and even as I was writing this, as you dive in, you just learn so many different ways in which gender needs to be considered and is not considered in transportation. And so for the brief, this brief specifically focuses on 3 areas around planning practices, affordability, and safety. And so I already mentioned the issue around single-use zoning, which is really rooted in traditional binary gender roles and gender division of labor. So you have these distances between care and non-care work, which really inhibits women from being able to participate in non-care work, as well as increasing automobile dependency, which is really important because women have less access to automobiles. So when you think about this from both women-headed households having less access to automobiles, as well as if you're in a household and you don't have as many cars as you do drivers, how are decisions being made around who has access to that automobile? So then what you look at the other side of public transit, and there's so many gender considerations within public transit as well. Most riders in the US are women, 55% in fact. And transit systems don't account for the needs of all genders. And so whether that's the scheduling around traditional male commuters with less service during off-peak hours, which is the typical time that care work is actually done, whether that's around fare policies where you get on, you get off, you pay. So every time you get back on, you have to pay again. But what about people who have multiple stops, particularly for care work? And so then that brings me to affordability. Transportation is actually the second largest household expense. And so you think about the financial burden of that, especially again for women who have those care work responsibilities, and as well as thinking about women and trans folks who actually experience high poverty rates. And so making those decisions around, can I go there today? Am I going to be able to access where I need to go today from an affordability perspective? And then lastly, just briefly want to touch on the safety piece. So looking at this from multiple areas, oftentimes transportation planners think about safety from traffic fatalities and injuries. And so women do actually experience less traffic fatalities and injuries than men. However, women have a higher risk of injury and fatality risk. And that's often actually because women are driving smaller cars. And we're seeing this increase in SUVs and pickup trucks, which really has the climate implications and really starts to get at, I know we're all familiar, well, we might not, but if you're familiar with seeing like during the Trump administration with the plumes coming out of trucks, and that was like really associated with masculinity. So we have this petro-masculine identity. And so that has implications for women and safety. And then a big one, which I'm really glad that Halima is on here from Alliance for Girls to really talk about gender-based harassment and violence. And so nationally, about a quarter of women actually report experiencing sexual harassment on transit. And we know that it's underreported. And so this leads to fear, which really impedes freedom of movement and actually influences women's decisions around transportation. At nighttime, am I going to take public transit, or am I going to pay more if I'm financially able to do so? Am I going to pay more for a ride hailing service? And so all of these kind of considerations, and there's so many more, really reflect the lack of women's voices in the planning process and in every aspect of transportation, from infrastructure to where the decisions are being made, because these considerations have not been taken into account. So it really makes us ask who's in the room and who's missing from the room. And really, if we're going to have equitable transportation systems, we really need to start with who's at that decision-making table.
Thank you so much, Reagan. So if you heard all of that, just the sneak preview of those 3 key gender considerations in transportation planning, and you want to learn more, check out the brief. As the author, Reagan goes into much more detail around, the analysis and the recommendations there around each of those pieces of affordability, safety, and more. So Reagan, say that you are someone who comes across this brief who is working on transportation policy, or you're someone who does a lot of work advocating to transportation planners. What are some of the key recommendations that you would communicate for folks who are wanting to better integrate a feminist lens in their transportation work?
Yeah, so as you started the conversation with, federal investments, we need federal investments that are intersectionally just and that incorporate all of these gender considerations as well as care work. And so the big one, which is contrary to what's happened, is an increase in public transit funding. We see the importance of public transit, particularly for women. And so we need an increase in public transit funding. We also need to target these infrastructure and transit investments in Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color and low-income communities. As you also said, we think of trains, buses, and we just think of them and cars, but where are they being planned? Who really has access to them? And I think what may be touched upon later in the conversation is in terms of climate and EVs, who actually has access to that infrastructure to have EVs, and are they even affordable to the people who need them most and would benefit most? And so where are we targeting these investments? So target them in Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. And then also integrating care and transportation investments. We had the American Jobs Plan, and then over here we had the American Families Plan. But as mentioned earlier, if you have a separation from where people go to work and care work, you're hindering people from even being able to participate in paid economy. And so thinking about integrating them, they should be one integrated plan. And then lastly, on jobs, and I'm so glad we have Ali from the National Tradeswomen Task Force to talk about jobs. We hear that infrastructure and transportation investments will create good, high-wage jobs. We hear about the Citizen Climate Corps. And so one, yes, we do need to increase access with explicit workforce participation goals, but also we can't bring women in, one, through tokenism. Oh, we have our one woman, we have our one Black person. We can't do this through tokenism, nor can we do this by bringing people into oppressive industries. So until we address workplace discrimination, particularly for trans folks, and harassment, until we address wages and having families sustaining wages, until we have universal childcare and family leave, we must also have flexible work schedules. And so it's one, we have to bring women into these industries, and two, we have to make sure that the internal work of these industries are done so that we don't bring them in to industries of violence and harm.
Thank you so much, Reagan. You're dropping a lot of wisdom on us. I really appreciate the ways that you're able to capture what is like a 20-page brief in your contributions right now around some of the key takeaways. I especially appreciate the way I think the role that care plays in this brief and how you're building these connections between care work, care infrastructure, and transportation and mobility, and the ways that they are so intrinsically connected in terms of getting folks to where they need to go and be, and also caring for each other and their families. That feels like a very transformative connection to be building, and for folks to be thinking about more deeply in their policy planning process. Thank you. So the last question I'll ask you, Reagan, before we tell everyone to go read the brief in full is, for everyone who is clicking on this link and saving it to read later, what do you hope that folks really leave the brief knowing?
Yeah, I guess 2 to 3 things that I hope folks take away. One, that transportation is really connected to every aspect of the lived experience. And again, I really appreciate your opening questions around how did you get to work or to school, to really think about how transportation enables movement is really an integral part of our lives. How do we move through time and through place? And so just really understanding how it's connected to every aspect. And then 2 is all the considerations of transportation. As I said, as I worked on this brief, I was even learning so much about the way in which all of the considerations that need to happen. Again, going back to that point around buses and cars, we think about even their design and the need for women to have strollers. And so thinking about something like that, access to the bathroom when you're waiting for a train or at a train stop, and the fact that not all stops have gender neutral bathrooms. And so how does that inhibit folks from using our transportation system? And so it's all of the considerations to really think about, which then brings me to my third point, which is to recognize privilege and the fact that so many folks don't have to think about these things, right? For instance, the idea around households not having, like making decisions around who can drive the car. I have family in Alabama where it's 1 car and 2 people. And so it's like, if you take the car today, what am I going to do? And so having to plan the whole day around who's going to then go run errands, who's going to then go to the grocery store for the family that day. And so the privilege to not have to think about that for some folks. Or during COVID, to not have to, the privilege if you didn't have to think about, oh, if the transit schedule service has been cut, then how do people get home late at night? I have a friend who spends like $40 coming back from work late at night because they have to now rely on ride hailing services because transit service has been cut. And so the privilege to not have to think about that. And so hopefully people read this and really say, wow, 1, transportation is important for every aspect of our lives, but 2, there's just so much to think about. And if we really want equitable transportation systems, 1, we need to think about and start asking these questions. And 2, we need to ensure that the folks around the table are reflective of everyone so that their needs are met with this transportation system.
Thank you so much, Reagan. I'm seeing some comments in the chat around folks' hands cramping up trying to take notes, and I am fully in agreement. I think, if those were the goals of what you hope folks take away from the brief, I think that they landed for me, and I'm so excited to hear what folks are thinking about and learning as they really dive deeply into this incredible resource that you've put together for folks who are thinking about transportation deeply or wanting to think about transportation through a feminist lens, and laying out so clearly what some of these connections are and how folks can think about these parts of transport planning that are so often, as you said, invisibilized, and make them more just. So thank you for sharing so much insight into how you were thinking about the content of the brief. And next, I want to move to our panel. Some really incredible folks who are thinking and moving at this intersection of gender, climate, and transport, and have a lot of knowledge to share, some of which is actually featured in the case study section of the brief. So next I'm going to turn to Logan. Logan Dreher is a climate justice organizer, working on building the power of local community-led organizations across California. And in her role at Grid Alternatives, she takes a reparative approach to transforming our transportation system. So Logan, I'd love to welcome you to the virtual Zoom stage, and hear from you. How does your feminist analysis shape how you think about transportation? What does it look like in your work, and what are some of the challenges that you're thinking about?
Thanks, Mara, and thanks, Reagan, as well. That was really awesome to listen to. So I guess I would start. That's a big question, and I would start by saying I think that transportation is such a site of feminist struggle, and I think really all public space is. Mara, you so beautifully led us to kind of reflect and think on our own commutes and how we move through public space. And I wanted to start just by talking about what my commute pre-pandemic used to look like. So pre-pandemic, I would, as a good climate activist, I would bike to my bus stop, where my bus came once every 30 minutes. So if I missed it, I would be late to work. And then I would put my bike on the bus and take the bus about 1.5 miles, because I didn't want to bike past these highway overpasses that didn't have any bike lanes. And then I would take my bike off the bus and bike about 1 mile to the office. And when I was on the bus, I was often thinking about and hoping that I wouldn't be harassed, because that was something that happened fairly frequently, enough that I thought about it every day. And when I was biking, I would hope that there were no police nearby, because I would bike on the sidewalk because there were no bike lanes and there were these really big industrial trucks, and biking on sidewalks is technically illegal. So I would always be sort of looking over my shoulder, hoping that I wouldn't be stopped by police and fined. And I think that experience really captures what we all are constantly navigating when we're moving through public space. And I know so often we come to these types of webinars really intellectually. We come thinking about policy and briefs, but everyone here, everyone listening to me is a person who moves through space and who navigates those same questions. So I would encourage you to think about, your own navigation of that space, how you move through the world, what kinds of questions and concerns come up for you, because those are questions around transportation policy. Everything that I experienced on my commute was a result of decision-making and planning, whether or not there were bike lanes, what kinds of safety, all of those things were decisions that someone else made that affected that 30 minutes at the start and end of each of my days. And I just want us to come in an embodied way to these conversations, because that's what transportation is. And I think, Reagan, you so captured that in your words today and in the brief, that this is not just about bikes and buses. This is about our bodies and our lived experience of how we move through the world. And that's something I think about a lot in my work around decarbonizing transportation, is that, we have these big climate goals, and this is about these big global issues, but it's also about people and how we move through the world. And because of that, and when I think about my commute, really some of what I think about and what I'm reminded of is feminist thinking. I keep thinking about that quote from Audre Lorde, that no one lives a single issue life. And to me, that's so true of transportation. When I'm talking about transportation, I'm thinking about housing and zoning and bikes and patriarchy and police and systems of policing, this expansive questions. And when we have this really narrow focus on transportation policy, I think we do a harm, because we are never going to get to a just and equitable transportation system by focusing on transportation policy alone. We really need to pull back our focus and have a more expansive view. And I think a lot of the challenge and part of why I want to take that expansive view is because I think we need to think a lot about our interconnectedness. And thinking through a feminist lens, I think our interconnectedness and interdependency is such a critical learning of feminist teachings. And because I work in electric transportation and thinking about electric buses and electric cars and e-bikes, I think a lot, and I think one of the big challenges of that space is thinking about how we do that work in solidarity with people of all genders around the world. And so I'm often thinking about Indigenous leaders in places like Bolivia and Chile who experience firsthand the impacts of heavy metal mining of things like lithium and cobalt that go into our electric cars and batteries. And I think the challenge is thinking through how we build a just transportation system, not just for us here in the US, but for everyone who touches that transportation system, and recognizing that the actions and the policies that we have here deeply impact people, even when we can't see them, even when we aren't necessarily thinking about them. But really, when I think about my feminist analysis, that recognition of the ways that we are entangled and interconnected with each other is so, so key. And that's why it's not enough to just replace gas buses with electric buses or gas cars with electric cars. We need to take a more systemic, and I like the way you said intersectional feminist approach, because we really need to rethink and transform our relationship to the land, to the resources, to the people, and to the labor who make our transportation system go. And right now, that relationship is really built on extraction and exploitation, right? We take the resources, we take the labor, we burn through them, and then we move on. And we need to build a transportation system that is founded on a sense of regeneration, a recognition of finiteness, right? There is a limit to the amount of resources and people. And I think we need to really be asking questions about who owns, who profits, who benefits at every single step of the way of our transportation system. And again, take that interconnected approach and realize that our lives and our decisions are so intertwined with people, even when we can't see them, even when we aren't necessarily thinking about them on our commute.
Thank you so much, Logan. Thank you for, I think, really doing the work of, at the beginning when I said that I hoped this webinar would serve as an invitation for folks to expand how they understand transportation, to be a part of their lives and what transportation includes. I think your intervention really invited us to think about the global justice dimensions of our mobility systems, and also the ways that transport is a part of public space, and that we all move through public space, and we all are thinking through questions of what moving through that public space feels like in terms of our safety and our autonomy and our access. Thank you so much for inviting us to think in those really expansive and generative ways. So next I'm going to move to Halima. And Halima is the Senior Advocacy Manager at Alliance for Girls, the nation's largest regional alliance of girls serving organizations. And in partnership with Alliance members, Halima drives advocacy efforts in the Bay Area to meet the expressed needs of girls and gender expansive youth. Also named on She the People's list of 25 under 25 women of color to watch, Halima is a powerhouse building political power for her community. So Halima, I would love to move to you next to hear from you a bit on how you and Alliance for Girls are really centering girls and gender expansive youth in addressing gender-based harassment and violence on public transport. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here in this space and really appreciate the other panelists for what they have shared, and really resonated with what Logan talked about, that this is such a multifaceted issue, and there are so many components of this that are impacting our communities. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the needs of girls and gender expansive youth, who I feel like often get overlooked in the conversation about transit. For girls and gender expansive youth, public transportation is something that they rely on to get to school, to get to work, access community services, medical care, and also fun. And oftentimes they don't feel safe on public transit. In 2019, we worked with youth researchers to publish a report called Together We Rise, and that interviewed girls and gender expansive youth of color in the Bay Area, and almost all of them shared that they did not feel safe riding public transportation and were facing sexual harassment. And so after understanding this need, we worked with community members, and we had town halls across the Bay Area to really understand what kinds of solutions community members wanted to see for this issue. And that's how we were able to develop one of the first initiatives of its kind called Not One More Girl in the Bay Area to address sexual harassment on public transportation. When I first started doing research to see what was out there, if there was a precedent for this, I found very little information and very little examples of work that actually included young people and had them at the table. So from the very beginning of this initiative, before we even passed the resolution with BART to advocate for this initiative, we actually had young people, middle school students and high school students from the Bay Area come and speak with BART's executive team, some of their board members, to share their experiences on public transit, what kind of challenges they were facing on BART. And that's how the initiative was able to kick off. Throughout the role, youth held 100 paid positions in the initiative, being paid a minimum of $18 an hour, in part because we wanted to make sure young people were, we need to be decision makers at the table. Young people rely on these systems, and yet they are very much overlooked. We have so many lines, bus lines that are specifically dedicated to school pickups. And there really isn't extra attention or resources or energy dedicated to those lines to really examine if youth are actually safe on those systems. When we launched Not One More Girl, one of the big things that we knew coming into this was that there was a huge lack of data. Public transit agencies often do not track occurrences of sexual harassment on their systems, and a lot of them seem to have this mentality of kind of being risk averse, and also putting the liability or the responsibility of staying safe on the riders rather than taking that upon themselves, which I believe needs to be a core part of how all transit systems approach safety and security. Another big part of this initiative was making sure we address the cultural component. So when we started this initiative, we partnered with Betty Ono, which is a Black women-led organization that does art and cultural strategy. We partnered with Black Girls Brilliance, which serves middle school youth in Oakland middle schools, and then the Unity Council Latina Mentorship and Achievement Program that works with Latinx high school youth in Oakland. And together, we were able to really ensure that art and cultural strategy was part of this, policy advocacy was part of this, and young people were part of this. And so what we were able to do was put together a 12-point gender equity action plan that resulted in policy change and cultural change. We knew it wasn't enough to change policies or even enough to gather data on the issue, but we also had to change the culture that normalized sexual harassment for so many young people on their way to school. In doing this initiative, we were able to result in a number of outcomes, and I'll preface this with saying two things. This initiative took us 2 years to complete. When we were first starting, this was right before COVID-19, and we were hoping to launch right when COVID hit, so we had to postpone the launch, which I'm kind of glad we did because we got more time to work on developing some of the components of this initiative. And then the second piece is just really noting the amount of work and time that goes into making something like this happen, and that this is really a foundation 101, and we're working on a phase 2 right now to really expand this and build on the momentum that we've gained. So after launching this initiative and working for like 2 years with our coalition and with young people, we were able to do a number of things. So we added a new reporting category on the BART Watch app called unwanted verbal and nonverbal sexual harassment. This is not included in the penal code, so this is not a non-criminal offense, but this was more so BART could gather data. BART also added a yes or no question about sexual harassment occurrences on their passenger environment survey. So we have data now from the last 3 quarters, and that number has, the answer from riders has been 12% at this last quarter. This will be something they'll continue to ask every single quarter and report back to their board. We also established one of the most comprehensive website pages that talks about how to get help if you experience sexual harassment or if you witness it, as well as all the resources available. So one of the big things that we noticed was that there were resources on BART, but a lot of people didn't know how to access them or what to expect. And especially with engaging BART police, we know that for many communities of color, police doesn't equate safety and actually is a risk for us. And so we want to make sure, if people were to make that decision to reach out to BART police, they knew exactly what to expect and what their rights were, and that there was language noting that if they did not want to engage police, they had other options. And so we outlined those community options. We also filmed a bystander intervention training video. We rolled out a series of posters. We went out to communities and we engaged over 300 people sharing resources and just talking to folks about this issue to connect with communities directly, and a number of more actions. So there's a lot that we were able to accomplish. And I think all this is to say is that young people definitely need to be part of the process. And I know for BART, this was a transformative experience for them to work with youth directly, to have them inform this, and they are going to be committing to having young people at the table in the future when they have station modernization or new station plans, to make sure that young people can input on what does safety look like for them on a station, because for young people, safety looks very much different than what it looks like for adults. And I will also link to the Radical Visions of Safety report, a youth-led research report that we released recently that talks about what safety means as defined by girls and gender-expansive youth. And it breaks down very clearly some of those key metrics that young people look to when it comes to feeling safe. And so that was a huge experience. And I really hope to see more transit agencies connect these dots and to engage young people. This is our system. Young people are not only the present of the system, but we're also the future. We're the generation that are going to continue to use public transportation, and data and research shows that young people are more likely to use public transportation and have a lot more trends that are leading us into that space. And so I think it's high time that transit agencies make sure that young people are at the table and that these systems are actually serving young people in those particular demographics.
Thank you so much, Halima, for your ongoing work and leadership in thinking about the ways that our public spaces need to be safe for all folks, including and really centering youth and young women and young gender-expansive folks, and being spaces where folks of all genders can use and move through them, whether it's for school or for play or for anything that they need and feel safe. Thank you for those comments as well. So next, and last but certainly not least in our incredible panel, I'm going to turn to you, Ali. Ali Perez is the founder of Texas Women in Trades, an organization bringing more women, minorities, and young people to the skilled trades. She discovered the plumbing and HVAC trades later in life and felt the need to share the opportunities that the trades offer with others. And she serves right now as the National Tradeswomen Task Force Communications Co-Chair. Ali also currently operates a plumbing company in Texas while raising her young daughter. So Ali, in the National Tradeswomen Task Force, you all spend a lot of time thinking about and advocating how infrastructure jobs like those in transportation can be available to and benefit folks of all genders. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you and what you're thinking about and working on, how we really can increase access to infrastructure jobs and improve workplace environments for folks of all genders. Over to you, Allie.
For sure. I heard a lot of what we're doing and what we want from a lot of the other panelists and from Reagan. I think the intersection is very real and very palpable and needs to be, we need to maximize that relationship. I think we all want the same things here, and that's a good thing, right? When it comes to women, we want fair access to jobs in infrastructure sector. Women, particularly women of color, have been overlooked when it comes to jobs like skilled trades, which is our forte, and transportation. And that means we haven't had a lot of opportunity in those areas, like construction, transit, transportation, utility, trucking, energy efficiency. I'll slow down. Water, sewage, electrical grids, all of this is infrastructure work here. And these blue collar industries are a means for women to have economic freedom. Personally, I'm a single mother. I'm a minority female under 40. I hit all of those boxes, and I definitely would not be able to provide the life that I want for myself or my child without being in the skilled trade. So personally, I've seen how it affects my life, and that's what we work to do is to bring those opportunities to other women, because we want to take care of ourselves. We want to take care of our families. We want these opportunities. We've proven that time and time again, when we have these opportunities, we thrive. We have the grit that's needed to excel in these industries. The challenge is, how do we get into these industries? And we have found, I've been with the task force a few years, but there are women who have been doing this for decades. And it takes, a certain perfect storm to make any kind of change. These things that we want need to be demanded on a federal level. Without them, you can't just assume people are going to do the right thing. They're not. I hate to say it, but it needs to be in the law so that they will absolutely follow the right thing. And that means that, federal contractors who get federal dollars need to be making efforts to recruit women and minorities. And it is hard. So how do those people get workers? It's pretty simple. If you ask women, right, we need certain things. We need childcare. We cannot work without it, and it needs to be accessible at times when we work. A lot of women who work on job sites are at the site at 4 a.m. I used to live in New York City in Manhattan. I wouldn't ride the bus or the subway at 4 a.m. So what is their situation like with their kids? What is that looking like for them? And they need safe, reliable transportation to get to these skilled labor jobs that can afford them a better lifestyle. So there again, that intersection. We want our workplace to be safe. I think that's a universal again for all women. We want to make sure that it's safe and to have a safe work environment. I mean, it's not just OSHA, right? It's feeling like you are comfortable on the job site after 8 o'clock at night with 50 other guys, and that's a very real situation that we find ourselves in. So what is in our infrastructure, what's in our federal laws to make sure that we are safe? And then once women are in, we need to retain them. It's hard enough trying to get women into these jobs. We have to be able to keep them in these jobs. And that comes with having great infrastructure, childcare, transportation. If you're not wondering or worried about how you're going to get to work, you're going to be able to get to work. Sorry, I get excited, interpreter. I'll slow down. Okay, and then lastly, we want to be able to grow once we're in these areas. We want room for improvement. We want to be managers and operational leaders. We want to be in the room where the decisions are made and where the decisions happen, the room where it happens. And we have systemically been kept from those rooms. So our fight has been long. It's been arduous. It's been all over the country, which is nice that as a national task force, we work with smaller organizations like Texas Women in Trades, with organizations like Tradeswomen Inc., Oregon Women in Trades, Chicago Women in Trades, who have a system already. So we're not recreating the wheel here. We're sharing that with each other, which is crucial and imperative for all of us to succeed, for those who have come before to throw the ladder back down so that people can continue to come on up. And what else? I mean, I could say more. could talk all day, but I think that's, you know, the gist and pith of it is we want these jobs. We need these jobs. We need these jobs to be more realistic for our lifestyle. And we need those jobs to be safe for us and for our families.
Thank you so much, Ali, for sharing some of your and the task force's work and thinking around this. You said you get excited talking about it. I get excited hearing about it, and all of the ways and needs and things that we can do to really ensure that infrastructure jobs, trades jobs, and transport jobs, which have traditionally been disproportionately benefiting men, no longer are, and are spaces that are accessible and beneficial to folks of all genders. So as we wrap up this portion of the panel, I want to pose one more quick rapid round question to you all. So I think something that happens with conversations like this is that sometimes when we talk about all of the ways that injustice persists within our transportation system, it's really important to, at the same time, ground ourselves in the knowledge that another world is possible and another kind of transport system is possible. And we can envision and build one together, right? So I want to ask you all to help us paint a picture of the kind of future, of the kind of mobility system that we are building. And I want to just ask each of you, you're building more just, more feminist transport systems in different ways in all of your work and lives. So can you describe to me in like 30 seconds, 45 seconds each, when you envision what that system of mobility and system of transport would look like or feel like, what do you see? What do you feel? I'm going to actually go backwards, if it's okay to put you on the spot, Ali, and start with you.
Okay, great. Yeah. We want young female minority workers on these job sites. We want them paid well. We want them to have access to childcare. We want them to feel safe on their jobs, and we want them to know that their children are safe while they're on these jobs, or whoever it is they care for. I think care responsibility goes outside of just children. Some people have spouses or family members who they have to care for. So they want to know that the people they love are safe, and we want to be in the room where those decisions are made. And we will bang on that door until we get in.
Yes, Ali, thank you. Over to you, Halima. What does this system in the future look like to you?
For the future of public transportation, we want a system that is truly safe for our girls and gender expansive youth to have access to safe and just passageways in their community without the worry for their lives, without the worry about what they should wear or what safety protocols they should be doing so that they can keep themselves safe. We want to see survivor advocates hired to transit agencies. We want to see trauma-informed approaches, survivor-centered approaches to addressing gender-based violence that don't include police. So ultimately, we're striving for community safety for our young people so they can have access to safe and just passageways.
Thank you, Halima. Over to you, Logan. What kind of transport system are you building?
I don't know that I have much to add, but I think in addition to safety, building a transportation system where people feel powerful and like they are in charge of the way that they can move through the world, one that prioritizes people over cars, and one that is really thinking about historic injustice and how to specifically target investment and attention to communities that have been harmed by previous transportation policy decisions.
Thank you, Logan. And last but certainly not least, Reagan, paint us a picture.
Yeah, I think we've continued to build off each other. So I guess I'll continue by building off Logan's statement around powerful, people feeling powerful. And so I started with saying freedom of movement, so the ability to move freely, easily, safely, and then also making sure transportation is reliable and affordable. And then I guess to bring it all together, people-centered and self-determined. And so building off that powerful to self-determined. And so I can't give a prescriptive notion of what that transportation system looks like, but what does community want that system to look like? And so making sure that the people that the systems are supposed to serve have voices and are leading the decision making. And so again, self-determining their transportation system so they can move around freely, safely, easily. Yeah.
Thanks to all of you for helping us paint that picture and like see that vision together. And I think what you just said, Reagan, around each of you building on each other's comments and interventions and also descriptions of that world, that also feels like the most feminist thing, is that folks are collectively really kind of generating that vision of what kind of more feminist transport system would look like together. So we are rounding out on our time together, but I do want to make space for folks who asked questions that were more sort of around details in the brief or particular pieces that are easy to answer over email. I commit to being in touch with all of you to answer those questions after this, but I did just want to create a couple minutes right now to offer panelists space to answer two questions in particular that I'm seeing. One around folks asking if there are particular things you want to see from this administration right now in transport investments or transport changes. And two, knowing that a lot of the ways that folks think about transportation revolves around urban transport realities and thinking about subways and bus systems. What are some of the challenges in particular of rural spaces and of transport systems, and some of the ways that we're thinking about transformation here in this conversation? So I'll leave those two questions for folks to offer any thoughts on right now. And if you have additional questions in the Q&A that come in the next couple minutes, I commit to answering them after this. So that question on rural and urban challenges and things that we want President Biden to do. Would anyone like to take on either of those or both?
I can jump in quickly
Please do.
and go back to my point around investments, federal investments in public transportation, as well as federal investments in inclusion of all genders in the job opportunities that will be created through investments in infrastructure and transportation. And so the systems themselves, but also investments in the people who are building the system and riding the system. And in terms of urban and rural, I think that our rural imagination needs to be more expansive. Oftentimes people say, oh, public transit, it doesn't make sense economically. And I push back by saying, how are we defining public transit? Because people often forget about van pooling services or other types of services that it's not prescriptive. We don't just say an urban solution will work or not work in rural setting, but what can particularly serve rural? We see that there's, like, for instance, services being taken to the people, where like medical services will have mobile vans or things like that. And so being creative with how we can reach people in less populated areas. And so just creative imagination around how to serve people in rural communities.
Thank you so much, Reagan. That was really valuable. Would anyone else like to chime in on either of these two pieces?
I'll jump in super quick. I know we're a little over time, but building off what Reagan just said and the comment that you made about self-determination, I think that folks who live in rural communities know how to get along, and there are already really deep practices of sharing and car sharing and ride sharing that I think just need investment in. And there are a lot of really exciting investments actually happening in California, in the Central Valley and other rural parts of the state around investing in things like community-owned car shares or community-owned van pools, where we have to recognize that public transit, like you were saying, Reagan, might not look the same that it does in really dense areas, but that doesn't mean that community-owned and public shared transportation isn't possible.
Thanks so much, Logan. Anyone else want to chime in on these two? Okay. Well, thank you both. And thank you to you all. Thanks to the audience for being with us for this hour, for joining the conversation. and for your commitment to really better understanding the intersection of gender, climate, and transport with that intersectional feminist approach. And as I mentioned earlier, we saw yesterday in the infrastructure talk updates indication that while this is the largest investment in mass transit ever, it is woefully insufficient and inequitable. And it may be bigger than previous deals, but it is nowhere near Biden's own climate targets, and more importantly, the scale of investment and change that we really need to build a more just and equitable transport system. So as we move into this next phase and folks are moving and pushing around the reconciliation package and the Build Back Better efforts, demanding commitments around jobs, care, and climate action, we have to see and think clearly about these intersections of mobility, infrastructure, and equity to get us all where we need to go. So as we close, I just want to remind folks that they can access the launched full brief in its entirety at the link that Andrea just dropped in the chat. If you're interested in staying in touch with WeDo and future work at this intersection and beyond, you can sign up for our mailing list also in the chat. Don't hesitate to be in touch. You'll receive a follow-up link with this recording and the brief as well. And thank you to the panelists for being here and sharing your experiences as well as your ongoing work and movement building. Thank you to the interpreters for helping us really strengthen our language justice practice. Thank you to my colleague and friend Andrea for supporting with the radical logistics. And thanks to Dr. Patterson for joining WeDo in putting together such a critical and timely piece to help us build the transportation system that we all just described. Thanks to you all. Enjoy your Thursday and have a really restful rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mara.
Bye all.